Have you seen the Ghost Player? If not, all you need to know is that he is not the... Our story begins not that long ago on one dark, rainy night when a group of thieves, whom all lived together in a small plains village, made a decision that would change their lives and the lives of the entire overworld forever. As those thieves were tired of living here in that village, as life there was just so dull and boring and cramped. They just wanted more from their lives. In fact, they all dreamed of living in a giant mansion like those of the Illagers, but they wanted something that would be far more luxurious and far bigger and more isolated. And so for that reason, it was on the following morning that the group of thieves said their goodbyes to the villagers and headed off into the wild outback of the world, looking for a place to build their home. And thus, over the next few years, they went everywhere, from the deserts, to the jungles, to the mountains, to the ice spikes, everywhere, all so that they could find the perfect plot. And after just a few years, they had it, as they had found a giant swamp. And well, it was perfect for them, as it was far away from all other forms of intelligent life, and so they had privacy. Also, the climate here was perfect for growing crops, and thus they would easily be able to sustain themselves. And the land was mostly flat, and so for that reason, it was going to be quite an easy build. And so, with all those factors being in perfect balance for the thieves, they quickly began construction of their mansion. And thus, it was over the next few years that they built a mansion, complete with giant trees and a private dock and a long winding stone path leading up to their mansion, as well as plenty of pumpkin farms all across the sides of their mansion. It was amazing. And the interior of that mansion, well, that too was amazing. As they built huge, silky beds, an expansive library filled with all the knowledge in the world that they could collect, wide balconies across the mansion to observe the majestical lands, as well as plenty of secret rooms. This was perfect, as this was their dream home, and there was nothing that they could do to improve it. And so, with that mansion, those thieves were finally able to live the nice life that they had always wanted. In fact, they soon decided to even invite some villagers over so that they could work for them and they too could live a better life. And so with that, hundreds of villagers flocked over to that mansion, ready to serve the thieves and to be rewarded greatly for it. And so all was good in that mansion, as the days were spent with the villagers out in the fields, working away, farming millions of pumpkins, being paid hundreds of emeralds every single day, while the thieves were inside, reading or exploring or just looking out at the sunset from their balconies. It was an amazing life for all involved, and it was like that for decades, until one day when everything changed. As it was on that seemingly ordinary day that fog suddenly began to consume that mansion. And this all happened so quickly that only a few very lucky villagers were able to escape their deadly fog. Now, no one knew what this fog was or why it came to that mansion, but what they did know was that any entity that did not escape from it was dead in mere seconds. Now, it took those villagers that had escaped several months to go and find another village to reside in. But once they had found one, they quickly told their story to all the other villagers. Now, initially, all of them were quite scared, and so, for that reason, they all decided to just stay away from that mansion and the swamp that it resided in. However, after a few years, when one villager heard of the legends of this luxurious mansion and the tale of death associated with it, he bravely decided to investigate it, as someone had to. And so it was on the following morning that villager told all the others his plan, and he bravely set off to that mansion. And in just a few days, he had arrived at the swamp. Now, it was still consumed in lots of fog, but despite that, he still decided to venture within it. But as soon as he did that, he began to breathe in the air from that fog, and well, because of that, nothing happened to him, as that fog was entirely non-toxic by that time. And so for that reason, he was able to walk up that path without issue. Now, when he got closer, he could see that that mansion was clearly not what it once was, as all the trees were dead and the mansion was overgrown and in ruin. And the water around these paths were clearly infused with some sort of poison, but still, knowing all that, he kept on moving, getting closer and closer to that mansion. And just a few minutes later, he was at the front door. Now, he was scared, but at the same time, he knew that he had a duty to explore it, as the truth had to be discovered, as maybe understanding the great tragedy that had happened here could lead to thousands of lives being saved in the future. And so, knowing that, he took in one big breath and ran right into it. And well, he was horrified with what he saw, as he saw the parts of the house being covered in blood. The floorboards were ripped apart, and there were cobwebs everywhere, filling in all those holes within the walls. It was a very strange sight to behold, and it seemed like no one had been back in that mansion since, well, the fog came. But still, he continued heading deeper and deeper into that mansion, recording all of his discoveries in a small book. And while it was incredibly unnerving to see all of this, it was also very interesting. And he did think that he was safe, as he seemed to be all alone. Well, that's what he thought, as after a few hours of exploring those empty halls, he began to witness some strange events. Namely, candles began to suddenly light from nothing, and they began to fly. As well as that, he began to hear footsteps. But they happened just so rarely that the villager just thought that it was a spider hiding in the walls. However, he was quickly going to find out that that was not the case, as once that villager took his first step into the library, he saw it. It was a Steve, but that Steve was different, as he was transparent and his body had a slight grey hue, and most strangely, he had no eyes and was flying. He was the ghost player. Now, words could not express how horrified that villager was at seeing the ghost player, and so for that reason, he began to run. But as he began to do that, the ghost player began to chase after him, and that villager suddenly gained the ability to see ghosts all throughout the mansion. Oh no, this was bad, very bad, but that villager couldn't stop to look at them, as the ghost player was still chasing after him. He could hear his footsteps, and so that villager ran and ran and ran, all while that monstrous ghost player followed him from behind, and he kept doing this until he was away from that mansion and was out of that fog, as it was then that the ghost player suddenly vanished. Now, that villager was completely terrified with what he had just witnessed, and thus he decided to run back home as fast as he possibly could to warn all other villagers of what he had just seen. However, by the time that villager had gotten back to his home, he was only able to explain part of his story when he suddenly dropped dead. This was wrong, and so all the villagers began to panic, thinking that this strange ghost player was coming for them, and they were all doomed. However, very thankfully, they all calmed down quite quickly, especially when the leader of that village came forward and explained his plan for saving their souls.
We must go into that mansion and lock away that evil spirit within it, so that he cannot haunt our world. But we must do that in a way that he will never be free. And thus, for that reason, I am proposing that we use our strongest block, iron, to do this.
Now, that sounded like quite a good plan, and so all the villagers agreed to it, and thus, with that, an army of villagers marched into that mansion, carrying with them as much of their iron supply that they could hold. And once they were at that mansion, they ran up to the entrance and blocked it off using all of their iron. And so, with that, they believed that the ghost player was trapped in that mansion and would be unable to escape, as the iron was almost impossible to mine. And thus, believing that they were safe, they all ran home and were just happy to be free and safe from that demon. And from that moment onwards, not a single villager would ever return to that mansion. And in fact, even the evil villagers, once they heard of this story, made a law of none of them going anywhere near that mansion, as they too were scared. But still, they all just moved on, and life went back to normal. Well, for now, as it was only a few decades later that a new Steve arrived. Now, that Steve had been asleep for a very, very long time. And so, for that reason, he had no idea that this strange mansion even existed. And thus, he just began to live a normal life, building a small cobblestone house on the side of a hill, along with a small mine on the inside, as well as a little fenced-off farm on the outside. It was a very nice house that he had built, and that Steve loved it there. But after a few years of living that simple life of just mining, sleeping, and farming, that Steve decided that he wanted more in his life. Not in material possessions, but instead in experiences. And thus, for that reason, after a few weeks of preparation, the Steve decided to leave his little home and to begin exploring the world, learning about its strangest mysteries. And so with that, the Steve began to travel across deserts and jungles and mountains and oceans and badlands and even the nether, always trying to uncover its mysteries. Well, that was until one day when he arrived in a small coastal village. Now, this village seemed to be like all others. However, it wasn't, as this village had a dark secret. And so that Steve just walked up to the villagers, as he always did, and he asked them about any strange or wonderful sights that he could visit that were nearby. However, when he asked that question, all the villagers stopped moving and were silent. Now, the Steve was quite confused by this, and so he asked again, but still nothing. But then, after a few minutes of just standing there, confused at what to do, one villager stood forward and without saying anything, gave him a map. Now, that Steve was weirded out by that villager's reaction, but there was nothing that he could do about it. And so he just took that map and began to follow it. And just a short voyage later, he arrived at the fog. Now, when he encountered all that strange fog, he thought he was in the wrong place, as none of it was recorded on that map. But still, he knew that he was in the right place, as the map said that he was. And so he just thought that this strange fog was the reason that he was given that map. And thus, he began to venture within it. Now, that Steve was quite scared with all this fog, as he had never seen so much of it. But still, this was quite an interesting sight, and so he was quite glad that the villagers had given him that map. However, after a few hours of exploring that fog, he finally saw it, the outline of that mansion. Oh, maybe that was the thing that the villagers were directing him to, not this fog. And so, thinking that, he began to row his little boat over to it. And luckily, as there was a dock nearby, he was able to tie his boat down and then explore. And so with that, he then followed that stone path up the hill and over to the mansion entrance. Now, he was a bit confused on why there was so much iron by the doors, but still, there were plenty of holes within the iron that there was enough room for him to fit through, and thus, he was able to get inside. And so, it was then that Steve began to explore that mansion, looking around the abandoned rooms of this impressive monument. And he did this for a few hours until he found himself in the kitchen. And he was just looking at the rotten food within it when he heard it. Footsteps. Someone or something was running to him as the footsteps were getting louder and louder. Now, that Steve was scared, and so he froze, just barely being able to get out his sword when the ghost player walked into their kitchen. Steve was terrified at this, as why was there a ghost standing in front of him, as ghosts aren't real, right? Well, clearly they were. One was standing right in front of him, and so the Steve then began to look around to see if there was an exit, but there was only one, and it was being blocked by the ghost player as he was standing right in front of it. Oh no. He was doomed. But then, before he could do anything, the ghost player began to scream and run at him. This was it. He was going to die. However, before the ghost player reached him, he just vanished in the air. That was weird. Very weird. But still, that Steve was terrified enough by this that he just decided to leave immediately. And so he got back on his boat and began to sail away from that mysterious mansion. And so it was also then that he decided that he had had enough of exploration and that he just wanted to spend his remaining days back at that tiny hillside house, living a simple life. And so, over the next few months, the Steve travelling hundreds of thousands of blocks, all until he ended back at his home. However, when he returned to that hill, he saw that torches were placed all over the land. He didn't do that, but still, he walked on, getting closer and closer to his home, when he saw it. An iron door had replaced his original oak door on his house. Oh no, he knew that something was going on, and he didn't like it. And so, that Steve, terrified at what was to come, just ran into his house, breaking down that iron door. However, when he did that, he saw nothing wrong. But he felt wrong, as he felt a sudden impulse to go down into his mines. Now, he wanted to resist that feeling, as he knew that if he did that, something bad was going to happen to him. However, he just couldn't get rid of it, and so for that reason, he gave in and began to walk down to his mines. But as he did that, he saw that all the torches within his mines were replaced with soul torches. Now, he had only ever seen soul torches in one place before this moment, and that was in the ghost player's mansion. Oh no. Was he here? And well, as soon as he began to think that, he felt a sudden chill within the air. And so, he began to turn his head around when he saw the ghost player just standing there. This was it. He was going to die now, and there was nothing that he could do to stop him. But before he could make a move, the ghost player began to run right at him. But before he hit him, he just vanished once again. That was weird. And so the Steve then began to walk forwards, looking at where the ghost player had just stood. And well, what he saw horrified him, as he saw a sign.
Free the ghosts, and your soul will be freed from me.
And so, seeing that, the Steve knew what he had to do. And so, to find out what happened next, you'll need to watch this video.